Now, Kenya remains short of funds in climate financing, despite being at the forefront in advocating for adaptation and mitigation measures in the war on climate change. And now, according to Africa Development Bank Group, Africa receives just $30 billion per year for climate adaptation instead of $277 billion. Sarafina Robi sought to find out how structures and policies can be streamlined to make the war on climate change a win-win for Africa. Take a look.
Under the veil of darkness, a dam in Old Kijabe in Maimahiu burst its banks on the 29th of April 2024 and swept everything on its way, killing more than 50 people. This exposed the existential threat caused by climate change, eliciting a heated debate on green financing and climate financing. Green financing is a loan or investment that promotes environmentally positive activities, while climate financing is one aspect of green finance which is particularly focused on the adaptation to the impacts of climate change or the reduction or limitation of greenhouse gas emissions.
Where do we find money or resources or financing, number one, at scale? And number two, that is affordable. And number three, that is accessible.
This is a question that most African countries ask, as they are the most affected despite emitting only 10% of greenhouse gases globally.
Africa alone needs $190 billion per year up until 2030 for mitigation. And when it comes to adaptation, Africa needs $50 billion a year all the way up to 2050.
I think the most recent estimate from the Climate Policy Initiative is that Africa needs $277 billion annually, all right? But what we actually receive is $30 billion annually, which creates a challenge where it's like, how are we supposed to meet our nationally determined contributions?
Why isn't Kenya and other African countries receiving these funds?
Say, for example, the Adaptation Fund under the Kyoto Protocol or the Green Climate Fund under the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They have stringent rules.
If you take the example of Kenya, the estimate in terms of what we need annually is around 460 billion shillings. But what we actually get, for example, in 2018, which I think is the most recent figure that the government actually tried to track climate finance for, was actually around 240. So we're barely even at halfway of what we need.
This henceforth called for proper structures and frameworks.
The legal framework in Kenya has just been developed. I think we would say that. I think that's the correct thing to say. It's been happening under agreements.
With the Climate Change Act of 2016, we're supposed to have a climate change fund where all money kind of pulls in for climate change and is spent from there. That's in terms of how the money is organized. In terms of how we raise that money or that finance for climate change, there's been a number of ideas. So, for example, the issuance of what we call green bonds, which essentially are domestic bonds that the government issues in order to finance specifically green projects or renewable projects, for example.
Disparities in disbursement remains.
These resources are allocated should be different, where those who need it most get it, while those who need it least don't have to get a lion's share of what they don't need.
We put together the US, Canada, East Asia, and Western Europe, and the Pacific. Those areas of the globe account for 84% of climate finance, right? Which leaves very little for the rest of the world. We're talking about the whole of South America, we're talking about the whole of Africa, as well as Australia, among others.
As these are being addressed, other forms such as carbon tax and carbon trading have been considered, but how viable are they?
The EU Parliament has already considered FTT, the financial transaction tax, as a means of raising resources to deal with climate change. And in fact, they've gone all the way to their parliament. So The idea of a carbon tax is no longer remote. We must have it firmly on the table.
That is what informed the amendment of the Climate Change Act last year. And now, just last month, we now have the carbon market regulations. That this now put in place a mechanism of trading in Kenya, or crystallizing or even protecting the interest of those who have the projects.
Does the public know of such initiatives?
I don't know much about climate financing, but I know there's an agreement that was drafted in 2016 out of the Paris Climate Agreement, of which the country is supposed to access funds from an international kitty that helps conserve the environment.
About climate financing, I don't know anything about it, so I just heard about it, and I think it's a good idea that the government have the civic education to the public.
Yeah, transparency ni kitu sana itahitajika kama kuna kule kulipa carbon credit.
This shows gaps in climate financing and awareness, raising questions on transparency and accountability.
We don't have a way of tracking expenditure, so we don't have, some other countries have what is known as budget tagging, or kind of tagging of climate expenditure, where there's a code that's within a certain program or sub-program that tells you that this is classified as climate expenditure.
Meanwhile, Kenya received 28% of the continental climate financing, as experts hope that better structures will be put to ensure transparency and accountability.